You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please elaborate on the child diversion policy and how this is rolled out and how does it help children. The child diversion policy is complete and currently it is being rolled out. It is intended to reduce the number of children who come in contact with the formal justice system, and the policy seeks to ensure that detention or institutionalization as a punishment for antisocial behavior become measures that are of last resort in dealing with children in accordance with the UN CRC and in recognition of the Convention principle that the best interest of the child is paramount. So, diversion was an ongoing process in Jamaica, but there was no formal mechanism to really streamline it. And what happens now is that this national child diversion policy is the structured mechanism for dealing with it, and it is now passed. So it will prevent juveniles that commit minor offences from appearing before the courts. For example, where a case meets a certain criteria, a constable in our police system or a court may decline from prosecuting a child for certain offences and instead deal with the offender by diversion or restorative justice, and a program that constitutes them going to the child diversion committee rather than the formal court system. Instead of incarceration, juvenile offenders would undertake community programs, for instance, with temporary supervision and guidance, and counseling and restitution and compensation of the victims. The juvenile offenders would also be provided with measures to facilitate psychosocial rehabilitation and to prevent recidivism. The implementation of the policy will also reduce the number of children who are exposed potentially to negative experiences in the formal justice system, because I have interviewed children in the justice system, particularly those with uncontrollable behavior who felt that their parents were the reasons why they were there. And one of the catalysts for really making us push through to remove that label was because just how angry and resentful a lot of the children were, and how toxic the system was becoming to just their emotional well-being, because they were really victims. They really hadn't done anything. And so in systems like this, we feel that those kinds of children sometimes even commit those minor offenses because they have not been addressed with the proper social and psychosocial interventions. So what we will hope to see is a reduction on the burden of our criminal justice system as well, with a lot of the children and even persons between the ages of 16 to 18 who come into the formal justice system. The benefits of this policy is that it serves as an option for the child offenders instead of going to court. It also gives them a diversion for their rehabilitation needs. It promotes as a tool restorative justice, which is, I think, a good tool to use in various jurisdictions. And it will enact legislation that authorizes a constable, that's a member of the police force, to decline prosecuting a child for offences and to deal with offenders by diversion, which in turn will actually promote better relationships with the police and our youth. Because over time, you will find that if a child sees that a police, whether a constable, inspector, superintendent, is really there to help them rather than to penalize them for being an adolescent in some instances, then you will find that our society will become a much more peaceful and harmonious place in certain communities. And it will also reduce the stigma of being labelled, especially if that child is in the formal school system. No child wants to know that they were, or their friends to know that they were up before court The other thing we feel that it will do is reduce the backlog of cases in the formal justice system, and it will also give our children the rights that they deserve in keeping with our international best practices. And also, it will reduce the risk of training young people in certain deviant behaviors and criminal mores and behavior from other juveniles when they're in custody. Because sometimes you put a child who commits a minor offense in and incarcerate them, and the child comes out worse than actually going in. So that program is now in place. It's being rolled out, and the Ministry of Justice has that under control.
Can I just ask, the constables seem to be quite essential here. Have they been trained?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they have been. And it's ongoing training as well. And the constable is like the community police officer. It's not a part of the... they're part of the police force, but they're not the ones. They work mostly with the communities and community surveillance and those kinds of things.
So does that mean you train those all over the country, or have you started piloting somewhere and then rolling it out? How is this being done?
We've started the pilot, and that pilot has a core of trained constables. They will. I don't remember where the pilot will roll out. I think it is actually in Kingston and St. Andrew to begin with, and then it will be rolled out to other parishes.
Thank you. Ms. Sharif?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, just a follow-up on the question on the constable. Mm-hmm. He seems to be given a lot of powers. Is there no fear that could be abuse of those powers?
Well, the issue in terms of the training, I think, would help. I think currently, when I get to the other data about violence on children and the impact of violence, and you'll see some of the statistics, you will recognize that there are some of the interventions in terms of the police that have been working to reduce the level of crime and violence in our country. So on the whole and in the main, we have to have a culture of trust in our country now to be able to realize some of these issues. If we were to start from the premise that we can't trust the police in fear of them abusing their power, then we wouldn't have the policy in the first place. So the training has started, and we will go from there.
You said that the constable might choose not to charge the child, but what would be his assessment?
His grounds?
Pardon?
What would be his grounds or assessment for?
Yeah, and is there a kind of are they told to mainly not have the children into the justice system? Is there any kind of main rule, or how would they assess this? Well, because it might be very easy that they would just go on like before, because that's what they've been used to. Mm-hmm. And also, that's the first question. The other one is, if the child is, after all, charged, would there then also be some diversion possibilities later on in the system by the prosecutor, by the judge, etc.?
Well, typically what happens now is when and I'm going to get to that question because it was asked yesterday, but typically with the new training that's taking place, those criteria for assessment is also in that training. What you can look for, what you should not look for, what you should charge for, what you can have leniency on, etc. So I don't think a child who has been suspected of murder, for instance, will be put in the child diversion program. A child who has been suspected of shooting with intent, a child perhaps for breaking into somewhere or shoplifting, or has antisocial behavior, or was in conflict with a community member, etc., are areas that you can look for, which under children being taken into police lockups now, basically you see when we get the regular and the weekly lists of the children who are taken into lockups, the various reasons why the police take them in are varying degrees. You have from murder, shooting with intent, breaking and entering, rape, etc. So those are some of the things that the child diversion policy will be able to do, and then the ongoing training with the police will be able to assess what they prosecute and what they don't, or what they hold the children for, or what they put them in restorative justice versus the formal criminal justice system.
Thank you. Ms. Aldoseri, did you put your arm up? No. Then it's Ms. Herzog.
Thank you. May I ask you whether you are also using restorative justice as a preventive measure in schools or other settings so that children learn about it and the culture of it is becoming more widespread? And what about the public? Mm-hmm. How do they perceive this kind of diversion efforts?
It is now, because remember the child diversion policy is just now being rolled out. And so there's a sensitization program with the public about what it is, and certainly within the agencies that deal with children and the Ministry of National Security. There is also the Safe Schools program, which is in the schools, which has also seen a reduction by 50% on the amount of violence, peer violence in schools. There is a community safety and CSJP, Community Safety, Justice and Peace Initiative in communities where the communities get together. The Minister of National Security has been doing a number of peace marches in areas with the police as well to bring up and bring a certain degree of trust between the state and the communities. There is also the Unite for Change initiative, which has rolled out a particular pilot, which you might be interested in. There was the community who asked for a specific intervention under the Unite for Change program, and it was to have a curfew for children, where the children were mandated to get off the streets by a certain time. And what the community does is they become the curfew supervisors. So the parents and the community members work together to make sure that the children are off the streets. So one is helping the other. And it's almost going back to it takes a village to raise a child. And it's looking at that pilot of curfews in a particular area that was considered somewhat of a hot spot in Kingston. And what they've found is that that curfew is actually working. So there have been a number of crime interventions for peace, for a number of crime reduction situations, dealing with community, dealing with the police. And we feel that that has also contributed into the reduction in areas in crime in some aspects by over 25% last year. Okay. The barrel children have a hard time with coping without a parent. They face suicidal risks and delinquency and risk of abuse. What is being done in response to this issue? I actually found the study last night. I pulled an all-nighter, so I have not slept. And the study I found was actually by a lady called Audrey Pottinger, who is a psychiatrist, psychologist in Jamaica. And she did a study of 80 children who had parents who had migrated. And the 80 children that she had interviewed spoke of some of the things that Mrs. Sharif was speaking about. Why you picked up on the situation was because the previous children's advocate raised it in a serious way, and so it went through all the channels and hit, as you know, your radar screen. No, there is a migration policy that Jamaica has. When the article came out and the former children's advocate raised it, when persons raise things in Jamaica, we actually take notice of it. And there is what is called a migration policy, which was enacted looking at the impact of migration on children. Because one of the things that the study also spoke about was that children who have parents that migrate suffer the same kinds of situations as a child from a divorced parent, as a child who has a parent that dies, as a child who is an orphan. So they suffer the same kinds of separation issues. Now, with globalization, we can't, as you know, say to parents, you cannot migrate to if you have a job, etc. But what we need to do, even though the policy exists, and we find a way to monitor the children via the policy, is based on what the study is speaking about, and even some of the other things, is find a way to monitor and follow up with these children. And while we're not clear, because the study only spoke to 80 children, while we're not clear on what the real issues are and how many children have a parent who is actually away, what I can tell you is that Jamaica comes from a culture where one parent or a family member we have a very large diaspora, for instance, in other countries. So we will try and track that information better, because I don't think 80, to be honest, is a real representative figure in terms of a catchment and a representative sample size to determine that this is a widespread situation. But it triggered a policy on migration, which was taken into consideration, and we actually have systems that are in place for checking up on these young people. What I will commit to do as a minister is to see where we are with it, so that we can give you some follow-up information, because it is important. Regarding children in the labor market, recalling what I had said and the reference to the $6.99 over 6 years, what are employers doing in terms of prosecution? And I believe I had answered that question before. Art for life for boys, why not girls? Actually,
excuse me, there was a question about informal labor as well, raised by Mr. Madia. I guess, what do you do to find out about informal labor and to stop children being used or abused in informal labor?
Well, one of the things that I had answered and said is that we had done the 3,000 inspectorate of perceived employers that were having children. But I understand what you're saying in terms of informal labor. And one of the things that we actually do is we have the survey that is now being conducted, and by the ILO we have the funding to do that, which will capture some of that data that we don't yet have. And the question that you asked earlier in terms of the movement between rural and urban, we're not picking up that there is widespread movement, but that survey would pick it up as well. Climate change. What strategies are in place for children in this regard? What we do now is we have teaching in our secondary, primary, and at our basic school levels. We have the cleaning of our beaches. We have tree planting days in Jamaica, which are initiatives that are carried out at national levels to better shift the attention on the impact of climate change on our country, its people, and our national resources. Additionally, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, which has a primary responsibility for the management of disasters and emergencies, has developed protocols for the management of children in disasters. In this regard, all schools, residential childcare facilities are mandated to prepare for disaster management, and so we have disaster management plans in place. So, for instance, if a hurricane is coming, which we experience anywhere between September to late November, those plans are in place. They're also mandated to have children's awareness of disasters and training of key personnel in these areas. And this is being done with a national plan in preparation for the understanding of climate change. One of the things that, the reason why we also plant trees is because we have to get our children accustomed to not destroying our watersheds, especially in our rural areas where many cut down the trees, and also in the disposal of garbage and recycling. We've started a major recycling waste to energy program where now plastic bottles And one of the things recently with the chick outbreak that happened across the Caribbean and certainly South America, what it led us to do was to really have a serious public awareness campaign on how to dispose of things like plastic bottles and styrofoam containers, because when it rained, the chick mosquito bred in fresh water. And one of the reasons why there was such an outbreak is because of the way litter was also disposed of. And so there was a serious, and it's still ongoing, on how to dispose of, how to keep your area clean, etc., which will also have a good impact on our environment and climate change ultimately. Is the level of crime relating to adolescents reduced because of the decriminalization of uncontrollable behavior? We don't have any empirical evidence available to support that there's a correlation at this time. However, there has been involvement of the National Youth Service Program, the Social Development Commission, and other community-based initiatives aimed at engaging unattached youth. The number of children that were charged also for uncontrollable behavior would not be enough to suggest that the removal of the label has contributed to the reduction in crime. Also, uncontrollable behavior was not a criminal offense under the law, so it would not be considered as a criminal activity. We have seen a reduction in crime in Jamaica by 16% in murder last year, 12% in shooting, 23% in rape, and 17% in terms of aggravated assault. Importantly, and I think you would want to hear this, we've had a 54% decline in police fatal shootings, and this was largely as a result of the intervention measures by the state with proximity and community policing, with the interventions, with more police in the communities, more police stations and postings, the Peace Management Initiative, the Community Safety and Justice Program, the Unite for Change Program, the anti-gang legislation. In 2014, there were 40 persons arrested and charged, actually 44 persons arrested and charged under the anti-gang legislation. Firearms were recovered, 2 of the most wanted gangsters were arrested, and 20 persons were arrested in relation to the lottery scam. A drugs for guns syndicate was disrupted, and there was an arrest of 5 major criminals between 2 countries in the Caribbean and Jamaica. What programs, plans and measures is Jamaica taking to prevent crimes against adolescents from happening on such a huge scale? For example, what kinds of interventions are taken with families to help prevent this? I couldn't find the data because I don't know that we have wide-scale or huge-scale crime on adolescents. And I spoke with the Minister of National Security as well, and he has agreed to try and identify that data that you seem to have in terms of huge-scale crimes against adolescents. But we don't seem to have that, we can't seem to find which data or which data source that was coming from. But in addition to the crime disruption programs, we've implemented the following. We have the Safe School program, is one that has seen a 58% decrease in the possession of illegal substances by adolescents. We've also seen a 53% reduction in violence in schools as a result of the Safe School program. We have a pilot community curfews program that was implemented for children to be taken off the streets at particular times, and the community members serve as monitors. And we also have peace walks in communities when we feel that there needs to be some level of trust between the state, the police, and all the players. Are children still held in police lockups? Yes. As at January 2015, there were 15 children being held in lockups. This situation may change on a daily basis. Is it illegal to do so in law? It is not illegal for children in Jamaica to be held in lockups. Jamaica is not alone in this regard. There are other countries, including the United Kingdom, where there have been instances where this practice obtains. Despite this, however, the approach in Jamaica is to avoid this as far as reasonably practicable And our countries recognizes that this is not an ideal situation, and as such, we have juvenile remand facilities which house children who are in conflict with the law.
Excuse me, could I ask how young are these children? And I would just, I guess you understand that yourself, it's no excuse that other countries also violate children's rights. So I would like to hear how young are these children, and how could you prevent anybody from entering the lockups when they are still a child, and for how long do they stay? How are they treated?
All right. Any child who is under 12 does not go into a lockup. The CDA comes immediately and takes that child. And a child is not put in lockup. If the child is taken for care and protection, then the child, until the CDA gets there, then the child is held at the police station. The issue as it relates to the other children, anywhere up from 13 to 18, or 13 to 17, I should say. The issue as it relates to police lockups, one of the concerns that we had was that they should not be held with adult detainees if they went to a police station, because for whatever reason, if a child is lost, if a child is in need of care and protection, if the police goes for the child because they believe that the child is going to be harmed, a child sometimes is taken to a police station as a first point of contact. We have worked with the police to identify one police station per parish, which is to be made child-friendly. We've started retrofitting 5, 3 of which are in rural areas and 2 in the corporate area, and we're rolling out the other ones shortly. Those child-friendly police stations will have police trained on how to deal with children. They will have a facility that has a homework center, a room for isolation, proper bathroom facilities, bunks, areas for recreation, etc. I have toured 2 of them in particular, and I am satisfied that they meet the requisite standard under the Beijing rules and in keeping in what is in the best interest of our child under our current CCPA. The issue as it relates to children being placed in lockups, there are going to be instances under our law where children have to be taken, especially if they're suspected for committing a major crime. What we endeavor to do is to have that child before a magistrate within 48 hours of when they're taken in. The issue, however, is that sometimes a child cannot be seen by a judge. So what the children's advocate has done is to work with the police, that even on a Friday evening, a justice of the peace might be able to see that child, or to try and get that judge as best as possible, or the judge to see that child, so that they're not held for more than 48 hours in a lockup or in a situation like that. But the Corrections Act under the police speaks to that. And if the police, as I say, verily suspect that a child has committed a major offence, they will be held in a lockup.
But then I wonder, once these one police station, child-friendly, in each parish has been established, would then children who are to be kept in lockups be taken to those police stations?
Yes.
Immediately, or if they are to stay for more than a few days?
Well, that is the intention. That's why we did them. So if the child has to stay for more than 48 hours, if the judge says remand the child and keep them at the lockup, then those facilities will have the requisite attendant things, the beds, the proper bathroom. No more than 5 or 6 children can be held in the lockup. And so what we also do as well is that I get on my desk every Friday afternoon a list of all the children that are taken into lockups across the island, what they're taken for. If we see care and protection, we immediately send the CDA in, regardless of the child's age, and take them out. If we see a child 12 and they can't identify what it is, we immediately send the CDA in to take the child out. And one of the reasons why we did it is because there were instances up to before 3 years ago, and even sometimes still, where a child will fall through the cracks. But on any given week, we have between 15 to maybe 21 children on average that are taken into police lockups across the country.
Thank you. Interesting. You can go on, I think, if you have more.
What happens in practice? The practice that obtains now, as I said before, is that the police issue a weekly list regarding children in lockups. The Office of the Children's Advocate, the Office of the Children's Registry, and the Child Development Agency combs through that weekly list to determine the purposes for which the child has been detained and to make the necessary inquiries and provide legal representation or other forms of assistance where necessary. The ultimate objective of this is to ensure that children are removed as quickly as possible as to appropriate juvenile remand facilities or places of safety, or in some cases to be released by the police. The social workers assigned to the Child Development Agency are required under law to make periodic visits to the lockups to determine if children are in such spaces, the circumstances, and to take the necessary action where special emphasis on those are being held as in the need of care and protection. The agency makes an average of 1,000 such visits per year. What are the measures being undertaken in practice to deal with gang violence? Yes.
Could I just ask, since we talk about juvenile offenders, can children still be sentenced to death penalty or life imprisonment in Jamaica under 18?
Not to my certain knowledge.
Well, is there anything in the law that prohibits it? Because that's what we need. I mean, if you don't do it, that's one thing, that's good. But we would like to know if there's a specific prohibition.
I will check that for you, but I know certainly not to death. That's the first issue. We will check on the life sentencing issue for you. What are the measures being undertaken in practice to deal with gang violence? I think I dealt with the anti-gang legislation before, but we also have set up under the anti-gang legislation an anti-gang unit established in the Jamaica Constabulary Force to focus on the investigation of matters relating to the larger and more established gangs, as well as to provide oversight on matters relating to lower-level gangs. There is also an introduction of a strategy to deny gang members access to firearms, the stricter control measures at borders, the stop and search of motor vehicles on the road. We introduce measures to curtail the sale and trade in firearms, deny gang members access to the proceeds of crime in the Proceeds of Crime Act. We also have ongoing anti-gang communication public service messages. And then, of course, the social intervention programs, which I spoke of before. What is the explanation for the suicides in correctional centers and attempted suicides? We've had one suicide in our correctional centers recorded to date. We now have a suicide and self-harm prevention policy, 2014, which came into being as a result of that recorded case. And that is in place with the Department of Correctional Services. Staff members were trained to detect, manage, and respond to suicidal tendencies. 401 have already been trained. The DCS provides counseling and psychologists, and the DCS is the Department of Correctional Services, provides counseling and psychologists in an effort to strengthen its ability to respond to issues. Suicide and suicide attempts in correctional facilities result from a number of factors, and children who enter correctional centers, especially those categorized as sometimes beyond control, have been diagnosed with things like conduct disorder, depression, and mental health issues. As at March 2013, there were 5,230 children in the care of the state, and they still face harm and inhumane and degrading treatment and deprived of rights, etc. Currently, we have 4,370 children in our 51 children's homes, places of safety, and foster care. We have a zero tolerance policy in respect of children being harmed, and we take the matter very seriously on any breaches. We continue to train our staff and management since 2012. We have spent close to 60 million Jamaican dollars in infrastructural improvements to our homes and places of safety. We also have a significant private sector involvement in charitable donations to the sector. We've also committed $60 million to build a therapeutic facility. And we've also have an arrangement for $1.38 million US dollars to now have a transitional program and institutional facility for 40 girls before they exit the system, because we felt that when someone turns 18, by law, they have to exit the child protection sector. And we felt that there needed to be a transition period for them to understand how to maneuver being out of the system on their own. So that money will go towards that. There have been significant improvements in the care provided for the wards in state care. The managers and caregivers continue to benefit from the capacity and training and the alternatives, the resensitization to standards of care, protocol on the child abuse prevention and responding to sexual abuse. And I can tell you as well that some of the children in the children's homes have my particular cell phone number. And I get WhatsApps and texts and calls to tell me what's happening. And when they do, I send the CDA in. Mr. Douglas can tell you to go and check on it. I go and speak with the children personally. I visit the homes, talk to them, see and feel what is happening. And if there are issues, we try and immediately deal with them. As well, and as a mother, I can say to you, of an adolescent, whereas we have our children with us, ultimately, a lot of these children really need a lot of love, which is why it is important to have the kinds of mentorship programs and one-on-one interaction, which breaks the divide between them feeling that they're in an institution only and feeling that they're in a place that really loves them. And so the trajectory that we've started on since last year is to treat every child as if they were our own, so that any child exiting the Jamaican Child Protection sector can actually feel that it was a value added to their life rather than a blight on or a stain on their existence. We want anybody leaving the child protection sector to feel as if they were living with their own parent. And so across those lines, we now have extracurricular activities. One girl in particular wanted to be dropped to school, and she wanted to feel what it was like for a parent to drop her to school. And in that particular children's homes, we had a mentorship program where mentors now sign on for 5 years with the children, and her mentor actually takes her to school, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. We put athletics now, because we feel if our children had the talent for athletics, they should have athletics. We also encourage them to do extracurricular activities. So we have our children doing very, very well in some areas and really, really excelling. And we can see the differences, and we've been measuring the performance. So perhaps at another date we can provide some of that information of where they're coming from in terms of the intervention programs and what we're seeing over the last year and a half.
Thank you.
Hold on, I wasn't finished, Chair, in terms of the harm. So I don't know if you had a...
Yes, just since you have mentioned the dropouts, is it an issue in Jamaica, dropouts of schools, especially for boys? Do you have data on that?
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. We do have an issue with some persons not attending school. I have the statistics I'll find it for you. Any incident which places a child in the care of the state at harm or risk of harm are treated as critical incident and investigated accordingly. Arising from the investigation of these matters, a number of actions are taken depending on the situation. In the circumstances where the perpetrator is an adult, one or a combination of actions are taken and may include referring the matter to the police, reporting the matter to the Office of the Children's Registry, which is a requirement under law, the dismissal of staff, suspension without pay, and verbal and written warnings to the member of staff. The government of Jamaican authorities will always maintain a zero tolerance approach. And we will continue to do this within the Jamaican law as it relates to our children. The National Task Force on Trafficking, etc., still a problem from rural to urban trafficking for sex work, etc. 1 in 7 cases prosecuted. Why? The other 5 are before the courts, essentially. Those arrests have been made, but when I spoke to the people at Justice, it really takes evidence as well for us to make those kinds of prosecutions. So we're hoping that the persons who have been rescued will give the necessary evidence so that they can lead to prosecutions.
Could I just ask, you mentioned that children in institutions and foster care, or at least in institutions, they have your personal mobile phone number, but I wonder, is there a helpline in your country? I mean, it's great that they can phone you, but...
Yeah, there is. I was just giving a personal example, but there is. Yeah. There is a helpline that they can call.
24/7?
24/7. It's called 188-PROTECT.
Yeah, so, and it's well known by children?
It's well known.
Yeah.
There's also apps for your phone that you can have via the Office of the Children's Registry. And so there are several intervention mechanisms. We have the Child Advisory Panel that they can call. There is a Child Ambassadors Program in our high schools across the country now and in communities. So there are several mechanisms that they can call. They're just like sometimes calling me. Okay. Under the Child Care and Protection Act, Madam Chair, sentence of death shall not be pronounced on or recorded against a person convicted of an offence if it appears to the court that at the time when the offence was committed, he was under the age of 18 years old, but in place thereof such person shall be liable to imprison for life. And this is Section 78. Thank you, Ambassador. What is the status of compensation to Armadale families? The families of 2 girls have been compensated. There are some legal issues that have to be resolved. The cases are before the Attorney General's chambers. What is the level of progress since the date of passing of the anti-gang legislation? And I think I mentioned that in great detail. Have gangs retaliated in response to the measures? There is no evidence to confirm that gang members are retaliating against its members or have mounted any such challenge to the state based on the measures instituted. Is there parental consent required for access to contraceptive? Yes, parental consent is required for children below the age of sexual consent, which is 16 years old. The access to contraceptives by minor policy of 2004 provides that parental consent is not required. However, the minor must be encouraged to involve a parent or guardian in the matter so that the child is not treated in exclusion of an adult. In relation to the Sexual Offences Act, if this type of service is provided by a healthcare worker, it could be viewed as aiding and abetting the minor. The Ministry of Health has developed a concept paper for cabinet submission setting out the issues that could arise by denying reproductive health services to minors, and is seeking immunity from liability for healthcare workers and other prescribed persons for providing these services in the best interest of the child. And we have been in those consultations with the doctors, with the Ministry of Health, with UNICEF. It has been rigorous, and the paper is now ready for submission to Cabinet. And I believe those were all the questions that you asked.
Thank you. But just to understand properly what you just said, under 16, they mainly need parental consent. But then you said something about when they don't need it, but they are encouraged to get the consent. Was that between 16 and 18, or is that...
No, that's under 16.
But you said that they have to have the consent. How could they both have to have it and not have to have it?
They're encouraged to have the parent. So what happens is the doctors, because it's under the age of consent, and if under law you could be charged for sexual abuse under the Sexual Offences Act. So the doctors, if a child comes in under 16 and says she needs or he needs contraception, the doctor has to treat with it in a very, very careful way and ask for the parent to come in. Typically, they ask for the parent to come in so that the parent is very clear that they know that this has been happening. Because if the child is being abused by someone over 16, for instance, the state has to know because it's an offense under law. So that is why they're encouraged to have it. And the doctors now are seeking any damages from liability, because they have come to us as policymakers to say, look, what is happening is that a number of the children are falling through the system because they're getting these STIs and STDs, because once you ask for the parent to come, you don't see them again. And so we've gotten together with a number of us as stakeholders, put a concept paper together for submission to Cabinet, which sets out all of the data, the statistics on what is happening when the child comes before you, to see how best now to treat with that situation, and how it will also affect the Sexual Offences Act and the penalties thereof.
Thank you. Then I understand. I wonder about the discrimination issue that was raised.
You want to ask it again?
Well, I asked first about the HIV and children with disabilities, whether you think they are discriminated against, but mainly what are you doing to because we have information that there is some discrimination going on, and also against children with a different sexual orientation, so-called LGBT children, and what are you doing in the way of awareness raising? What measures are you taking to end discrimination against different groups of children?
The government of Jamaica is opposed to discrimination or violence against all individuals for reasons of gender, sexual preferences, or other reasons. And this is enshrined in our Charter of Rights, of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, and enshrined in our Constitution in April of 2011. So we don't condone discrimination of any type under our Constitution.
No, I understand that you don't condone it, but what do you do to combat discrimination? Do you have any campaigns, any awareness raising?
Well, certainly in our schools it is encouraged not to discriminate against anybody, and especially with children with disabilities. We have a serious HIV campaign, and what you have seen is certainly in Jamaica, where HIV/AIDS is concerned, you don't have that kind of discrimination the way it was even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Children with disabilities, now with the Disabilities Act, I know the Minister of Transport and Works, in dialogue with some of the heads of our NGOs and even with the ministry, through our transportation sector, will be dealing with campaigns to make sure that children with disabilities who take our public transportation system are not subjected to any abuse. And in terms of what you raised with the LGBT, I have met with LGBT groups as a Minister of Youth. They're very vocal in Jamaica, and certainly where needs be, where sometimes they are felt to be in harm's way, if one group is feeling that they are in harm's way, then they have the right channels to speak to. So in terms of discrimination, I wouldn't say that we tolerate discrimination, and that is certainly enshrined in our Constitution.
Thank you for this explanation. There is a brief question on breastfeeding, if we could take that by Ms. Kazova. I think that would be the last question, unless there's anything else. Ms. Aldozeri, we need soon to come to the concluding statements, but Ms. Kazova.
Thank you, but basically Chair has already raised it, but particularly taking into account these indeed tremendous positive developments in the country, I was surprised to discover information about really very low breastfeeding rates, and what are the reasons. We don't have time to elaborate on it, but are going to tackle this problem, and whether there is any link to the provision that, if it's true, that it is not allowed, that employers do not allow mothers with newborn kids or small kids to make breaks for breastfeeding, whether there is any provisions, and any links in these two things. Thank you.
Jamaica was one of the first countries in the world to pass the Maternity Leave with Pay Act in the 1970s, which allowed mothers to have maternity leave with pay up to 3 months, essentially. And we have a very, very rigorous breastfeeding campaign throughout our primary health care facilities, etc. I saw the report that was sent in by the NGO on breastfeeding, and I know that in the best interest of the child, what you are encouraging is breastfeeding up to the age of 2, in some instances, to 6 months. Typically, mothers in Jamaica breastfeed up to 6 months. One of the other issues, and I'm not sure if there's a correlation in the recent ILO survey that came out, that the top 3 countries in the world for having the likelihood of having a female boss, the number 1 country is Jamaica. And you have Colombia and St. Lucia. So Jamaican women, we are a matriarchal society. And so in several instances, you have women who are working mothers and who pump breast milk as well and leave at home. But typically, you will have mothers breastfeeding, certainly for the first 3 months in Jamaica. And it's encouraged in the hospitals. As a personal example, when I went to have my child, I was told not to bring any bottles to the hospital because it was a breastfeeding policy hospital in Jamaica.
Yes, Ms. Herzog.
Thank you. I guess what is also important here, whether the maternity leave is long enough and guaranteed that mothers can breastfeed their children up to 6 months exclusively, which is also a very strong WHO recommendation. However, obviously, the longer breastfeeding would mean that children are also getting solid, so that's not an issue. The question is obviously not up to 2 years. How long can you encourage the women to breastfeed? But the first 6 months would be important to be. So, from this respect, maternity leave is also an essential question, and also you can see the outcomes later because of the better health status of children. And not mentioning the emotional bonding part, which is also essential.
Thank you. I hadn't Mr. Madi on my list before, and I think I forgot to give you the floor. I'm sorry. And then Ms. Aldoseri, I hope we can have some quite brief statements at the end.
I think you have read my mind, and you asked the question I wanted to ask about the helpline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Madi. Then to Ms. Aldoseri.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Briefly, can you give us an estimate number of mother-led families? I know that the number is big.
I don't have that data in front of me, but it's quite a number in Jamaica.
Any support given to these families?
Mm-hmm. The same PATH program and other programs that are socially protected by the country.
Then Ms. Sharif.
Mr. Douglas, the dropout rate in schools. Look in the first document, it's in there.
Mike?
It's just a clarification question on birth registration. I understand registering birth is one thing, having the birth certificate in your hands is another. That was actually what I meant earlier.
Thank you. Still, there is a systematic program for the registration of children who don't have birth certificates, and the RGD is on a serious campaign to make sure that those who are not registered are registered because they need a birth certificate to go to school.
Thank you very much. I think then we need to go to the concluding statements. And is it Ms. Sharif who will do that on behalf of the... No, it's Ms. Aldoseri on behalf of the rapporteurs. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the end of this morning's session, I would like to thank you one more time for your cooperation and for the extensive answers you have provided, Honourable Head of Delegation, for the many questions we have put in front of you during the dialogue yesterday and this morning. Many questions, however, remained partially not answered. We're also happy to see that many acts and bills have already been adopted and enacted, especially during 2013-2014. Many others were passed by the Parliament, and we are waiting in anticipation to see the impact of the implementation of those acts and bills in reality in your next report. As obvious from the dialogue, violence still remains one area that needs to be addressed as a top priority with the involvement of all stakeholders, not forgetting the family and school. Current legislations on violence have to be fully enforced, and tighter legislation has to be introduced in order to curb the amount of violence committed against and by children. I should also take the opportunity to tell you one more time that we are looking forward to receiving your initial reports on the 2 optional protocol, not forgetting to urge you to consider ratifying the 3rd optional protocol on a communication procedure. Thank you one more time, and safe travels home.
Thank you. Then I pass the floor on to you, Head of Delegation.
Madam Chair, rapporteurs, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Jamaican delegation, we really want to thank you for taking the time to listen to us and for being open and objective in what we had to say. I know over the years you've had several reports from NGOs and a number of independent agencies, and you've had to mull over several pieces of information, both between government and really what was happening, and not perhaps sometimes having the clarifying factors which allowed you the opportunity to come to your own conclusions. I really hope that us being present here today gave you an indication that while we have not solved all of the issues, that we have made significant steps to correct some of them, and that we're heading in the right direction to work in the best interest of our children. Certainly over the last 2 years, we are on a trajectory to fix those issues that we felt were important, like the separation of children from adults, and certainly put in place pieces of legislation that were not in place for a number of years. We too, like you, are eager to see that the implementation works in the best interest of our children, and we will make sure that those happen. In the questions that you felt were not answered in its entirety, we are committed to provide those answers, in particular to the statistics, 1 or 2 statistics that you asked about. One was in relation to the maternal morbidity, and the other one was in relation to the dropouts in terms of students at schools. And so on behalf of all of us, I want to also take this opportunity to welcome you and invite you to Jamaica so that you can see it and feel it for yourself, and so that you can understand who we are as a people. We're a very strong, assertive, and confident set of people who has given the world tremendous excellence in so many different ways. And we want our children to continue on that trajectory. And so we will continue to work in the best interest of our children. Thank you so much for being patient, and all the best to all of you as you journey back home as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this concluding statement, and also for your invitation to visit Jamaica. I don't think we would mind doing that, any of us. But I would also like, on my own part, to thank you for this interesting and open, I would say, dialogue. I think it's been really good to have these discussions with you and have the clarifications that you've given us. And then it only remains for me to wish you all safe travels, and please give our regards back to the children of Jamaica. Thank you.